Hi, I'm Harnoor, and I use she, her pronouns.
And I'm Eve, and I also use she, her pronouns.
We're novel youth ambassadors, joined today by Lauren Lee, who uses she, her pronouns, a member of the Rising Voices Collective and author of Living in Snakeskin.
Before we begin, it is important to point out that this episode does contain discussions of sexual assault and sex work. While we won't talk about anything too graphic, discretion is advised. Living in Snakeskin tells the story of Fang, a 16-year-old who travels to the States with hopes of earning money and providing for her family. However, she soon finds herself struggling to pay off her debts and lying to her family. She finds work as an illicit massage parlor, but finds herself trapped in the numbing and repetitive job just so she can make ends meet.
So personally, my thoughts on this story, I mean, definitely there were points of it that were difficult to read, but I think it's such an important narrative because it draws attention to issues that I think a lot of people would just choose to ignore. And I think like writing from the perspective of somebody that's forced into sex work is so important because those people in media are often used just as like narrative tools or like even often like background set decoration. And they're often like really dehumanized in, books, movies, TV. And like it's sort of like prevents us from seeing them as like full human beings. I mean, oftentimes like the death of somebody who works as a prostitute, like it's a really common trope for that to be just like something that's just a plot device, and it's never really mourned or never really seen as like the death of a person that affects other people. And I also think that this story draws attention to how vulnerable young women, especially young immigrant women, are to being systemically exploited. Not to mention that Asian women are constantly dehumanized in Western society, being seen as like sexual objects on top of the dehumanization that normal, like all women face, right? And, I could just go on and on about how important this story is and how this perspective is one that's so necessary and how you did such a good job writing it. But I think at the end of the day, it's just like it provides empathy for a group in society that is often neglected. And, that's what makes it so special.
Yes, I completely echo everything that Harnoor said. I really loved reading this, and part of the reason that I really loved it is because I didn't love reading all of it. Like, it's really difficult to read. There are some really heavy parts and especially as a young woman, sex trafficking is a very real threat to me and to us. There's recently in the Black Widow movie, I always bring this up, the main antagonist is this human trafficker and this rapist and this abuser. And I always talk about how this particular antagonist is more scary or more real or more threatening than any of the other like purple alien guys because he's actually real. There are guys out there. There are traffickers. Human trafficking is a thing, and aliens are not. And I think that that's a really important thing that is more common in media that I've liked to see rather than just being used as a plot device like it usually is. Now, it's rare that sex workers are not used as a plot device, but we are seeing stuff like in Black Widow or in like Your Incredible Story. Like exactly what Harnoor said, sex workers are demonized while men are actually and actively enabling sex trafficking, and they're just excused. And this active participation of being an assaulter, like the clients at the massage, is very different than just being an enabler through like consumption and support of like sex trafficking or like pornography, for instance. But it all falls under the same umbrella. And what I really love about your story, Lauren, is that you give no excuses for men. And another part that I really, really loved was the ending, which like I won't spoil, but intergenerational trauma of woman is something that I am so passionate about, like to speak and to read about, because I think that so many more people need to understand it on such a wider level. And I just love it because your story directly confronts things like the prevalence of sex trafficking and intersectionality and intergenerational trauma and so much more, things that are not nearly talked about enough and would be like significantly less prevalent if they were talked about more. So truly amazing, and also just beautiful writing.
Yes. So thank you so much for joining us today. And so we have a couple of questions about the novella. And the first thing that intrigued me about it was the title. It sort of, it gives me imagery of like shedding away your older self, like the whole like snake shedding thing, but then also like growth and change and like, snakes have been used to symbolize a whole bunch of different things. And so I was wondering why you chose the name Living in Snakeskin and what it represents.
Yeah. First, thank you so much for having me. But the title is a little bit different from what you thought it was. I first came up with it because in my research, I learned that people that help smuggle humans, like to America, Chinese people, on boats to America, they're called snakeheads, and a lot of the times the journey doesn't end when you reach America, right? You're in debt. You have to figure out how to get out of debt. You got to figure out, how you're going to make it in America. And a lot of times you're trapped by the snakeheads. And even though you've reached your destination, there's still so much more to go. And I guess the title is meant to say that, you know, she has no options, and that she's trapped with the snake head, that she's in debt and she can't really do anything about it. Yeah.
I really like that, and I didn't know about that. That's like, it's really good to have that, the context, and then it's also cool because like I like hearing about how readers have a specific interpretation, like Harnoor, and like your actual intention. Like I love that, and I love that that's able to be portrayed um, in this story. I had a question about like a specific part in the book. So chapter 9 focuses a little on the American dream concept, plus like this Kim Kardashian, it seems like nobody wants to work these days concept. You know what I'm talking about? And you write that immigrants like Li Fang are, and I quote, told that if they just work hard enough, they'll be able to live the successful life families that their families dreamed of. And then you write about how it's a dangerous lie. But I'm really interested, can you talk about specifically the dangers in that concept and in that propaganda?
Yeah. I've read a lot of stories about the American dream, and a lot of stories about immigrants who come to America expecting things, my family included, and it's not exactly what it's like when you like hear those stories. There's so much struggle that I think people don't talk about. And personally, being a child of an immigrant, I don't even hear those stories. I don't hear the struggles that my parents go through, and they don't talk about those stories. So, even I one time thought that, the American dream was this really grand thing. And I think when you hone in to those experiences of those immigrants, what they actually go through, you can learn a lot about, how dangerous it is to believe that, coming to America, you're going to, miraculously find success. There's a lot of work in that. And also that a lot of immigrants, especially like in the story that I'm talking about, who end up going into sex trafficking, it's because they had no idea. They thought that, they had no idea that they were going to be involved in this, or that this would be their only option, because that's what they were taught. They were told that, they go to America and it's grand. And that's what their neighbors are going to tell them too. The neighbors, when they send their kids home, because their kids are not telling them that that's what's happening to them as well.
No, exactly. There's a culture of silence and like this applies to so many things overall, like, I can talk so long about the American education system, and we can talk about how, or like, how, like, girls are told it's not all men, and then go out into the world playing literally Russian roulette. And like, that is a very prevalent theme that you just talked about, Lauren, and I really love that. And I think that it's really cool that you are able to portray that in your writing, because we really don't talk about these realities, any type of reality, honestly, when we're talking about American propaganda, nearly enough. And so I think it's really important that young authors are getting those messages out there like you are. And writing like so stunningly while they're at it. So seriously, brava.
And you touched on a little bit how like immigrant parents tend to like shelter their children from all the hardships that they had to go through in their journey. And I think Eve was talking about this earlier with how like the ending intergenerational trauma was brought up. So I was wondering like how you think that, you know, like the trauma of immigrants can affect their children, and also, you know, like how are the children affected by knowing what their parents had to go through, but then also sometimes how can they be affected by being sheltered from the harsher realities of it as well?
Yeah. I think for the story generally, I normally in other writing pieces, I write very autobiographical pieces. But this time I really wanted to talk about the stories of the people in my family. But at the end, of course, I wanted to tie it back to me in some way, in some ways to my identity. And the ending was something like that, where the daughter finds the diary, and she learns about those stories. Because when I was writing this, I was also like learning at the same time about the stories of my family. And I think that when you hear the stories of struggles, when immigrant children hear the stories of struggles that their parents went through, I think there's a lot of pressure to get it right. That, if they weren't able to achieve that American dream, now it's the burden's on your shoulders. And if you don't achieve it, the burden's on your children's shoulders. And that's a really heavy burden, especially when the American dream, isn't real. And that can be really dangerous. I read a book, I forgot the title of it, but it talked a lot about how Asian Americans, they tend to be go through depression because of the pressure that they feel to make the struggles of their parents worth it. And that is something that stays with you throughout your whole life if you don't confront the realities of, that it may not be possible to make those struggles worth it in a way. And I also think that, if you don't hear those stories, it's also dangerous, because that's a part of, for me, hearing the stories was really important because it's a part of my history, it's a part of my culture, and it's a part of the way that I'm growing up and the way that my parents have raised me. And if I don't know about it, then I'm kind of not understanding a part of my life and the part of why my parents treat me in this way or why my parents act in this way. It's a way to understand, your parents, why they give you so much pressure, or why they protect you and shelter you so much. Trying to understand your parents and also understand yourself and how they're affecting you and the way that you grow up.
I mean, yeah, I definitely agree. Coming from an immigrant household and like knowing how my parents grew up has been like really sort of helpful in understanding like, you know, there's some like there's certain times there's like rules, and then there's stuff like there's conversations we will have that say like people like other people I know aren't having, and then there's conversations that like are very like taboo in my family, and it's like that whole like it helps to know the cultural background of your family in order to sort of like navigate how, you know, being an immigrant is different than being like, you know, coming from a family that's been in America for a long time. And like shifting gears a little bit, the story also deals with sex work and sexual assault, and that can be a really complicated and nuanced issue. I mean, there's a lot of people within the sex work industry that want to be doing what they're doing, and they want it to be legalized and seen as a legitimate form of work, because often it isn't. And but there's also, it's an industry that where there's like a lot of illegal activity happening, and many people are forced into it and suffer like some of the worst imaginable trauma. And so what do you think like the difference is between like what's the sort of like legitimate sex work that activists are fighting for, and the situation that Li Fang finds herself in? And you know, how do you think people should be like how do you think people should like differentiate between those two situations?
Actually, I think that it's similar in the fact that I also did some research in like research in illicit sex parlors and things like that when I was writing this story, and I read these anonymous interviews with people that were actually working in these illicit spas because they were kind of forced into it because they had debt, whatever it is. And they also said something along the lines of, obviously they don't want to be in this work, but that's the only line of work that will take them, being illegal immigrants. And in some ways that work benefits them in giving them the life that they can like have and hopefully improve for themselves and their families. But at the same time, it's horrible. It's still sex trafficking. It's still something that can be very damaging for them mentally and physically. So I think the line is really blurred. It's really hard to, give a definite answer whether or not sex trafficking should, I mean, not sex trafficking, but sex work should, be legalized, not legalized. It's very nuanced. I think it's very hard to say, but I think that it's also not really my place to say. I think it's for the people that are in sex work, the people that, both situations, that are there voluntarily, that are there because that's the only way they can make a living, for them to voice their opinions on. And I hope that through what I'm writing, it can be also a platform for them to voice their opinions in a way.
I am literally in love with that. And like, also just the idea that like of being able to step back and just listen is just such an important concept that I think is underplayed a lot because of social media and how like literally anyone can talk. But like being able to just consume different resources and just like listen and watch and be able to read interviews like the one that you read or stories like the one that you wrote is, I think that's so important and very vastly understated. So just like kudos for that. And I also had a question along the lines of like sexual assaults and sex trafficking. So Li Fang survives multiple sexual assaults. It doesn't begin when she starts working at the massage parlor, and continuous sexual abuse and obviously sex trafficking. And this content is important. It's incredibly important to read and write about, especially with the stigmas that we were talking about earlier. But it's heavy and it's difficult, especially as you are a young woman, a young Asian woman yourself. So what was the hardest part about writing these scenes, and how did you go about writing them?
Yeah, I think a lot of the times when I'm crafting characters, I want to base them off, someone, or base them off me or something like that. I personally don't have that experience that Li Fang went through, but I think that I'm naive to these issues, and I wanted to write. I want to characterize Li Fang as naive in the beginning, and the first encounter with sexual assault that she had, I had no idea how to write it. The whole process was extremely hard because that's not something that I know about that well, and I definitely had to do a lot of research and talk to a lot of people and have hard conversations. about it if I wanted to portray it and give it the right justice. But yeah, I think yeah, the hardest part is probably just trying to make it accurate and trying to convey to the audience that this is like a very real thing that people are going through, and a part of that is really making it realistic and something that can happen to anyone. I mean, the first scene, she was not working in an illicit sex parlor. She was just trying to get to where she wanted to go. She just wanted to travel, and it still happened, from people that she probably trusted. I mean, these people had the same goal as her. They wanted to go to America just like her, and it still happened. So yeah, just trying to keep it realistic, keep it make it seem like it's something that does happen, so that people know that this is common. And even though it's not my experience, I really wanted to learn the most about it and portray it in the best way possible.
I think that is extremely poignant, like the way that you've just described it. And I want you to know that I am in love with like everything you are talking about right now. Just yes, exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I absolutely like. I mean, it's difficult to read, but like as it should be, and it doesn't like shy away from the really like harsh realities of anything, and it doesn't try and like make anything sound better than it is, right? Or like, it doesn't skip over anything, right? It shows things as they really are, which is so important. It's like, because when you sort of ignore an issue or you don't talk about it because it's taboo, that sort of just allows it to continue, right? Like the more things are hidden, the more that they can be perpetuated. And so, bringing attention and like bringing like stuff like this just like into like the broad daylight and being like, this is happening, this is real, this is how it's happening, and like we have to confront this reality and help the people who are stuck in it, is so important. And I think you just did such a wonderful job of that. And I mean, like, I could tell definitely that you did your research, which is so amazing and so important, when people are like writing stories like this. And yeah, just like fantastic job. I mean, just overall, like, amazingly written. I could not think of a better way to do it. And our next question is about intersectionality in this story, and that's how a person's various marginalized identities can interact and overlap with each other. And for Asian women specifically, they constantly have to deal with being objectified in the Western world more than other women. Asian women are, stereotyped as submissive, and, for years they've been used as like sidekicks or like flat romantic interests that are very often like sexualized and not given a real personality or like any sort of humanity. And many of the clients who visit Lee are adult white men that are the same group that are sort of often notorious for sexualizing Asian women. And then on top of this, Asian people in general are often supporting characters in media with no complexity or struggles of their own, honestly just seen as like exotic set pieces a lot of the time. So I went on a little bit of a tangent, or like I started rambling there. But my question is, what role do you think Orientalism, which is basically like, treating Asian characters as uh, objects, plays in this story, and what role do you think it plays in media in general?
Yeah, I think all of that you said is very, very true, and things that I wanted to address in the story. I wanted to put her in the role that, white America has been putting her in, except giving her those like emotions and like amplifying them and making her human. So, yes, she's sexualized because that's the truth of it, right? She is seen as submissive and less than because that's the truth of it. But then you like really you grow with her, you understand her and her feelings, and that's what humanizes her, and you know I guess breaks that stereotype in a way by saying, regardless of whichever mold that you try to put her in, she's still very human, and she still has her own like personality, and her struggles are amplified through, whatever mold that, she's put in. The second question, I don't remember.
Oh, yeah, my second question was about sort of like Orientalism in media in general.
Yeah.
Like, like all of Western media.
Wait, what was like the question? Sorry.
It was like, how do you think like Asian characters are portrayed in media in general? Like, as characters, how do you think they're used?
Yeah. I personally never see Asian Americans on screen until very recently. And what you said is true. Yes, they're always like sidekicks, always like the very like scandalous, like sexy character that like has no other personality trait. I think Lucy Liu is like one of those breakout like Asian American actors, and if you even look at her like all the films that she's been in, it's the same kind of archetype, and it's really saddening to see because she obviously has so much to explore, and she's probably a really great actor, and a lot of Asian Americans are probably really great actors, and they just always put them in the same role, and it's so obvious like how racist the media is, American media, in portraying Asian American women. It's it's actually it's a very disgusting. It's very obvious. They don't try to hide it. They see us as, and it comes from the history. It comes from I think if I'm I think I'm accurate of this. Long time ago when Chinese immigrants were coming to America, they wanted at some point they wanted women to come as well because they wanted them as prostitutes, white men. And then suddenly they were like, no, these people are dangerous. They're dangerous for the Christian ideals. They're morally like just immoral, and they're horrible. And then they put these stereotypes and these ideas of Chinese women like in the media and like in people's heads. But the reason that they're here doing sex work is because there's a demand for it, and it's all part of the history, how they characterize Asian women and how they continue to characterize Asian women. But the truth is, the reason they're characterized in that way, or the reason that they're seen in that way, is because white men wanted them to be like that. White men wanted them as prostitutes.
I think, okay, first of all, props on the history, because I was familiar with it, but I always love hearing about like historical context because it's so important. And second of all, well, actually, not even second of all, this is just like point A, like it directly causes increased gender-based violence to Asian women, this hypersexuality sort of trope, the that's so often portrayed in media. And so I really love that you touched on that and are able to like touch on so many things in this story. Like, I think it's very easy to look at things at face value or to even just look at a different interpretation of the same thing. Like when we read stories about gender-based violence or about racism or even specifically about sex trafficking, I think it's really easy to, like we've been talking about, dehumanize it. And these are not statistics. These are people like Li Fang. She's like, yes, you made her up, but like she also exists. She is real, and the consequences of hypersexuality, racism, and gender-based violence, as portrayed as their effects on Li Fang, is happening every day. And I think that it's incredibly important that you talked about that. So thank you very much. And I was wondering, when you are writing this, you mentioned how you did a lot of research. Was there did you pull, not necessarily about like the sexual assault, but like immigration experiences or just like arriving to the States? are any of these stories that you pulled, as you mentioned earlier, related to your family or your friends? Like, is there a personal bearing in these things? And I know that's a bit shifting gears, but
Yeah.
I'm very curious.
I always want to make my stories either, talking about my experience, because my experience is the Asian American experience, but also experiences of other people. I try to amplify that in some way through my writing. And definitely this story was one of those stories that I could really talk about other people's stories. And especially the beginning was largely drawn from people that I've talked to, my grandparents, my mother, other immigrants. The first chapter, when we hear about Li Fang in her hometown, that is my mother's hometown. All those experiences, I actually asked my mother about, how her daily life was, how she, where she went to, cash in her ticket to get food, what she did in the farm and things like that. All of that was directly from my mother's experience. And the second chapter, when she's going to America on the bus and then the plane, that is exactly the route that my mother took, that my grandparents took, and especially the ending when she arrives in America and she wants to use the bathroom, I think, and she asks someone who she thinks is Chinese, and that person actually is Japanese and has no idea what she's saying, and she feels so alone in the new country. That is my grandma's experience. She told me that she asked someone for the bathroom and it was a Japanese man, and she couldn't communicate to anyone, being a new immigrant, and that's super isolating. And I wanted to capture that and make sure that their stories were also heard.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing. I think um, we had another, like, forgot what it's called, um, Rising Voices Collective author who wrote When We Get There. And he also pulled on the story from his parents coming to America from Argentina. And yeah, I just think it's a narrative that doesn't often get told by immigrants themselves. And so hearing it from the children of immigrants and, hearing how authentic it is, I think that's so important. And I've really enjoyed our conversation so far. And now we're going to do some more rapid fire questions. So our first one is, who is an author that you really look up to or whose work inspires you?
Oh my god, this is hard. I don't really, I don't really know authors. Um, uh, the author of Because of Winn-Dixie, she's a children's author and she writes like chapter books for children, but I loved her books growing up. I hated reading, but I loved her books, and that's probably why I write now, because if I didn't read those, I probably would not be writing. So, yeah.
Katie Camilla has a lot of very good books. I will say, like, definitely in like my reading funks when I was younger, it was like the Magic Tree House. Oh god, I would read those books. I'm interested. So we talked a little about published books, but I'm interested in, was this the first story that you've published? And if it is, how did this, or whatever the first story that you published is, change your process of writing overall?
I've published in like a print anthology a poem about my great grandmother. And I've like put stuff online. I think this is the first time where like it was advertised and it was really put out there that this was a story that I wrote. And I think there's a lot of pressure, trying to first like address such a hard issue and try to make it accurate and make it like very true to the experiences of people that actually had those experiences. So it was very, very hard, a lot of research. I still want to hopefully do more research and maybe do a rewrite of it. But yeah, like, just I learned a lot through the process of researching. This is the first time I had to research for a story.
I mean, you did a great job. So, like, I don't know, the pressure didn't affect the quality of the story because it's fantastic. Um, and you were talking a little bit about how it was a really hard topic to tackle. And so, what advice would you give to authors also trying to write about really difficult subjects like this in their work?
Um, I think that when I was writing it, I tried to connect it in some way to me, in my identity, and in some ways, like, of course, the very real experience of sexual assault and the experience of immigration, those are things that I can't say that are my experiences, but elements of her personality and the way that she grows as a character was kind of drawn from who I am. So being able to find a way to connect it to yourself so that, you know, it feels closer to you, it feels like this is something you can write about because it's you, made it easier. But also just not being afraid to like ask people, not just doing research, but like really talking to people and like asking their experiences and having those conversations. I think it gives a much different perspective than just reading it online.
Sorry, I just muted myself. I fully agree. I'm very curious about any advice you would give to your younger writing self or just your newer writing self, which I will also like take notes on because you're an amazing writer.
I'm still very new to writing. I started I think last year, 2 years ago. I didn't like write seriously. I was always bad at writing until like I really started getting into it. So I think just like having confidence and just like going into it, knowing that your first draft's probably gonna be a mess. Your second draft probably a mess as well. But just like knowing that you're gonna grow and that it's fine to, you know, have really bad stuff at first, because I always thought that, you know, I couldn't write because I was just really bad at it. But I think it's just a process, and you know, you as you're gonna grow if you're writing.
That's fantastic advice. I mean, that's really fantastic advice for any new thing that you want to pick up. I mean, like, I forgot who it was, but I was listening to this podcast and this lady was talking about like how doing stuff for like the first or second time is like the worst it's ever gonna be. And so like, while you're doing it, you just have to remember that like it's like I'm not gonna be happy with what I do for a little while, but then I will become good at it. So you just gotta push through it. Um, so what is the first book or movie that made you cry and why?
Um,
Rhymed.
I don't cry on books or movies, but Coco, like Disney's Coco, I cried so hard. Every time I watch it, I cry because I think of my. So I mentioned I published a poem about my great grandmother, and she was very influential in my life in trying to discover my like racial identity. And I think when I watched Coco, she had recently passed away, so I thought of her and I cried a lot. But even now, when I watch it, I cry because it's very heartwarming.
Oh, I love that. I actually haven't watched it and now I have to. Um, I don't cry at like books or movies either, like ever. Like it has to be a significant. Have you ever watched Promising
No.
Young Woman? Oh my god. That was it truly screwed me up. I highly recommend it. Highly recommend it. Like trigger warning rape, but I highly recommend it. But it really did screw me up.
I don't
Oh,
cry at books either. So like we formed an alliance here.
yes,
So, like
exactly.
there was there was there was one time where I think we were watching there was somebody's phone connected to the TV and we were watching a movie and the screen kept glitching but a character was
Oh
dying
no.
and everybody else in the room was crying really hard and I felt really bad but the screen kept glitching like over her face while she died and I was like laughing really hard. So yeah, that's Maybe it's better to be a crier.
It's the safe option.
Yeah.
I sometimes like laugh at inappropriate moments, and I'm
It's a
like,
coping
Eve, you
mechanism.
can't laugh right now.
Coping
You have to
Yeah.
be sad right now. Exactly. Thank you. I have found um, a kindred soul. Kindred souls. Yes, that's the word I'm looking for. Lauren, I'm really interested as a writer. What's your like kryptonite overall as a writer?
I think trying to write something that is not what I experienced. That's definitely like also like the hardest part writing this is like if I if I've experienced it or if I've like heard stories of it, then I can very clearly picture it and be able to write it and paint like a scene. And if I haven't, I have no idea where to start. And that is super hard. Most of my work, I think I try to stray away from that. I try to write about my experiences. So, yeah, hopefully I get better at it. But just trying to write something that I have no idea how it would even go down or how I could imagine it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like the age-old thing of like write what you
Mm.
know. Like it's just so much easier because you've experienced it. Um, and speaking of writing, what does literary success look like to you personally?
I think for me, writing is a very personal thing. I use writing to grapple with a lot of things that I'm going through. Like, I think recently it's racial identity. Most of my works have been about racial identity, but I want to write about other issues. I want to write about body image. I want to write about being a woman and all those things that I as a person also grapple with. And I think that once I'm able to write it, that really like I think signals that I've also been able to grapple with it and really think about it and kind of maybe not completely solve it, but really just have a conversation with myself about what I'm struggling with. So yeah, hopefully being able to just write a like open up to myself on paper and write about what's hard for me. That's success, I guess.
Yes, I really like that. I have a another question about like your writing. Do you have like a writing schedule? Because I know for me, like being a writer is like not writing for 90% of the time. But how much do you write? Do you have like a schedule
Um,
for yourself?
Currently, I'm in a program based in New York called Girls Right Now, and we have like workshops and like submission deadlines. I never get on like working on the submission deadlines until like I really feel that spark. Like I really feel like I have something to write. So it's very spontaneous. Like I try to write when they tell me to, but it's very like when I get it, I get it. Like I had a story that I was working on. It's due in like late May, but we had like months to work on it. I finished it like 12 a.m. at night, like just one random day that I just really felt like I could write it. So I think it's just whenever I feel like I got it.
I love that. And also, absolutely same. I've written 20-page essays in 48 hours. So I get you.
Yeah, like I mean, like sometimes you just like open up a Word document and you just stare
Yeah.
at it for like hours on end, and then there are other times where you're like literally a writing machine. You're like my fingers cannot move fast enough to like keep up with how quickly the thoughts are pouring out. So yeah, I think it really does depend on the flow of
Mm-hmm.
inspiration. Um, and so, have you read any books that made you feel differently about fiction, or any books that like changed your mind on a topic or changed how you saw the world?
Um, I think I can mention like two books. The first one, like when I I said that I didn't like reading until I read, like, because of Winn-Dixie and all those other books. But when reading gets hard, I also like started not liking it at some point. But I read a book called Red Queen. I don't know if you heard of it, but it's like fantasy. It's really great world building. I really loved the book, and I really want to be able to write one day like fantasy and really be able to like build a world and be confident in that world that I built, hopefully one day. So that's one of my inspirations. I definitely could not be farther from that genre right now, hopefully, but that's the goal one day. Another book that I read, The Book Thief, I think it's very common. People have read it. I love historical fiction, like historical themes and reading about that. So I think that's like closer to what I'm writing right now. And I think that process is also very lengthy. It's very hard to get things accurate. So yeah, that's what I'm working on right now. And yeah, I love reading that.
Yeah, I've read and loved both of those. I remember I actually read Red Queen. I in middle school I did this thing where I tried to read like 50 or 60 books in a year. And I read Red Queen in the middle of that, and I found that I don't remember a lot of those books because I was just reading so much. But I remember that I really liked the fantasy world, and that it had like a really solid plot
Yes,
twist
yes,
at the end. I
it's
just
so
cannot remember
good.
what it is.
You just remember
Yes.
the feeling.
Yeah, basically just remember
That's
like,
good.
oh my god.
Like being able to write a plot like that,
But I don't
that's the
remember why.
goal, you know?
I don't know if
Yeah.
I've read Red Queen, but I've definitely read The Book Thief. It was a required reading for my class. My teacher, my 8th grade teacher, read it aloud, which I actually really liked. And like in the last chapter, see, this is an example of inappropriate laughing. Everyone was crying, and I thought it was funny that everyone was crying. And I was trying really, really hard not to laugh because everyone was crying. And like, okay, the part that made me laugh was that these were a bunch of white Christian or LDS kids who were just like, I don't know how to quite describe it. They're just crying over this thing that I know that they would not care about in another context. I was just kind of sitting there watching them like, okay. But actually on that kind of track, what was your favorite? That was definitely not my favorite, but what was your favorite required
Oh,
reading book from school?
I don't remember. But it's so funny because you guys were saying that you read those two books like in middle school. I do not read that much, obviously. Like I think most of my reading is required books, but I have no idea what I've read most of the time. I think unless it really speaks to me, like out of my mind, like I forget about it. So I can't really answer that. Nothing has really spoken to me in the past few years, I guess.
It's like the after the test thing where like somebody asks you a question about what you just took a test on and you're like, I'm done. I don't remember it anymore. I did what I had to do.
It's out of my brain now. And no, like I understand that. I love reading. I have a lot of books, but I will not read something for school simply because it is for school. Like, actually, this year I've like the best English teacher I've ever had, but before this year, I don't think I really read books for school. Like, I would just jump in on discussions on like some vague, obscure point they said, and I'm like, yeah, and this is how this relates to intersectional feminism, and I'm going to talk about that because I know about that, but I don't know about this book, but I know about that.
Actually, I have an idea. This year I haven't read too many books, mostly like short stories and like speeches, because I think we're learning like rhetoric and argumentative writing. I loved reading like speeches of activists. Like those were, and just analyzing them and how they like crafted those are awesome. I loved reading those. Books, not so much unless they are really good, unless they hook me in the beginning, you know.
Yeah, we're doing rhetorical analysis too, and our textbook is actually really cool. It was written in like 2017 or something, and so it has a lot of really progressive ideas for an English textbook. And there's chapters on like women's rights and the climate and like what was it? It was like civil disobedience and stuff, and they take like really old essays. Like we had to read like something by Henry David Thoreau, and then they also have like really new essays, like stuff that's being published in like the New Yorker right now. And I think that's really cool. That like I think that's really useful use of required reading, because it sort of like opens your eyes to like issues that are happening right now. I mean, not that like I have some problems with the required reading in US schools. A lot of it is like white men being like, I sure am a white man and life is so hard for me. And it's like, for sure, my dude. Cool that you can sit down and write. Like, cool that you have the privilege to do that.
Like, no, you are definitely the victim here.
Yeah, it's so sad that women don't want to date you. Aw, Ugh. Yeah. Okay. It turns out I have a lot of problems with required reading. Um, moving on. Where do you see yourself in the future, and what are some other projects that you want to take on?
In the future, I think I like I've been, as I said before, like very inspired by like essays, like argumentative essays. I love those, and I think that in the future, I really want to find a way to just like culminate all my passions. I'm a CS person. I'm also an activist. I like talking about issues that Asian Americans experience, also like environmental issues, but also a writer. Like there has to be some way to like put that all together, because I don't want to give up any of that. I recently just finished a piece that used elements of all of that. I wrote a poem in code about being Asian American. It was very very complicated, but hopefully like in the future I can be able to do more things like that and find creative ways to just be able to express all my passions. That's the goal. I don't think that there's any like one place like I want to be. Just being able to continue like practicing my passion and like doing everything that I love at once, that's like really important.
That's amazing, and I love hearing that you're an activist. I am too. Um, and I think it's also really important to like be able to fulfill all of your passions. Like there's this social media influencer slash author slash historian slash activist slash former organizer. Her name's Blair Amani, and she was one of the person who was like, wow, like you can do a lot. Or like oh god, I don't know how to pronounce her name, but like Hedy Lamarr or someone. She was a really famous actress in I don't know when, but she also like was the driving force to creating the internet. And like you can do all of these things, and I think that it's or like Carly Kloss, she's a supermodel and also like a coder, and she started like this nonprofit. And I think it's really cool and very important how many things that we can do. And so congratulations. And actually this segues really well into, before we wrap up, are there any projects that you're working on right now or that you've done in the past that you want to shout out, do a quick plug?
The project I just talked about, that it's kind of like a journal that I'm working on. It's meant to be written completely all in pen in a notebook, and it's written in code. It's a poem exploring Asian American identity, and the goal kind of is like breaking that model minority myth that like Asian Americans can be perfect. So I document just all the mistakes I make in writing that code, because I'm definitely not the best coder. So every single mistake I make in there, it's all in there, and the piece is not just the finished product, but also like the mistakes I've made. And another like aspect of it's a very complicated project, but hopefully I can continue like adding on to it as I grow and understand my identity and like other problems that I might grapple with. I add that in, and it'll become kind of like a journal for me, as well as like a writing piece, a poem. And hopefully when another person like me, a young Asian American woman, like picks it up and reads it, they can also know that someone else struggled in the way that they're struggling. That's the goal of that piece. I'm also, that is not done. It'll never be done. As I grow, it's going to continue to grow, but currently the first working version is done and going to be published. I'm also working on something else called Elephant Conversations, and it's going to be a collection of conversations I have with myself, like in my head, about body image, something that I struggle a lot with. And I think there's a lot of like internal struggle, and the premise is like I'm gonna address the elephant in the room, for me at least. I think that it's not like when people talk to me like in a regular day-to-day basis, it's not an elephant for them, but definitely for me it's always like in the back of my head, and I think that's for a lot of people struggling with that. So documenting like those conversations, that's like something I want to do, and hopefully that will be a sign that I've been able to grapple with that issue. And one day I might put it in the code that I'm doing now, and it'll all be connected. It's going to be fun. I don't know. Still like planning and thinking about it, but yeah.
Oh my god, both of those sound so fantastic. Oh my god, that's literally, I love the idea of just like documenting all of your mistakes. Oh, that's so it's like literally something that I would put in a museum. I'll call up the MoMA. I'll say you got to hear about this, you guys. And yeah, elephant conversations sounds fantastic as well. These are just like such unique ways to, deal with stuff. I mean, I'm a big art person, but I love when people use like the medium or like the structure of a story to like contribute to the idea of a story. I think that's very, very cool. I love it when people do that. Um, and again, a huge thanks to Lauren for being here. And if you're interested in reading Lauren's novella, Living in Snakeskin, or in learning more about our work in Novelly, be sure to check us out at www.novelly.org. Yeah.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah, this is a great conversation.